Legends of Greek Mythology, the story of the king and the oak. There was once a beautiful grove in Thessaly which was sacred to Ceres. The trees in it had been growing there for nobody knows how many hundreds of years. They were very, very large, and their great branches grew so close together that scarcely a ray of sunshine could penetrate to the ground underneath. It was cool in this grove, even on the hottest summer days. Little fawns and their mothers lay on the pine needles in the shade, feeling safer there than anywhere else. Birds sang from the tops of the tallest trees, and many a nest was hidden under their leaves. The temple of the goddess stood in an open glade in which were sparkling fountains, whose waters kept everything fresh and green. Here grew the grandest tree of all, a gigantic oak, so tall that its top seemed to reach almost to heaven. Its lower branches were thickly hung with wreaths and votive tablets, on which were written the thanks of people who had received the help of Ceres. Every tree in this grove was inhabited by a hamadryad, or wood nymph, whose life was bound up in that of the tree in which she lived. If the trees died, the hamadryads would die too. Such groves were never cut. At noon, all these nymphs used to dance around the great oak, and sometimes Pan, with his little horns and goat's feet, came and danced with them. Close by, a king of that country was building a new palace. When the walls were finished, he wanted timbers for the roof. One day he came into the grove of Ceres, bringing with him 20 woodmen, each of whom carried an axe or a saw. The king told the woodmen to begin at once and cut down every tree in the grove, but the men, knowing that the grove was sacred to Ceres and that the trees in it had been allowed to grow undisturbed for more than 1,000 years, hesitated about carrying out such an order. Then the king, in a fine temper, caught up an axe and with a ringing stroke sent its blade into the trunk of the beautiful oak. A shriek followed the stroke of the axe. It was the voice of the hamadryad, but the king said that it was only the singing of the axe, and he would not stop. Just then the old priestess came out from the temple and told the king very gently that it would not be wise to anger Ceres, and she reminded him that the goddess had power over everything that grows out of the earth. At this the king's strokes only flew the faster, and he spoke in a very insolent manner to the kind old priestess. "Stand off," said he. "The axe may hit you. The next time you see your trees, they will be in my palace roof." Without another word, the priestess walked quietly away, but a strange expression came into her face, which suddenly bore a close resemblance to that of Ceres herself. Soon the great oak fell with a crash. There was a moan from the dying hamadryad, and an answering wail from the other nymphs of the grove. The woodmen were frightened, and would gladly have spared the other trees, but the king insisted that every one should be cut. The king's palace was soon completed, and it was a most magnificent structure. All went so well that the king began to think Ceres had forgotten his destruction of her sacred grove, or had not the power to punish him for it. But the punishment came soon enough. At the command of Ceres, Famine now came to Thessaly. Famine, a servant of Ceres, was a frightful old creature, who, wherever she went, pulled up every green and growing thing, and then sowed hunger broadcast. On the approach of famine, the beautiful fountains in the grove of Ceres, which had fed nearly all the rivers in the kingdom, began to dry up, and the rivers they had fed became nothing more than little brooks. The rain ceased to fall, and all the crops failed. The peasants became discouraged, and one by one they took their goods and their flocks and herds and went away to other lands. One night, in spite of guarded gates and bolted doors, Famine walked into the king's own palace, and then the king himself learned what it was to be hungry. He laid the blame on his servants and treated them so badly that they left him, one after another. At last there was left in the whole kingdom only the king and his one daughter, Metra, who was faithful to her father through all his troubles. Ceres still withheld the rain, and scarcely any living thing could grow. Where the fields had been green and where flocks of sheep and great herds of cattle had once fed, there was now only bare sand. Travelers still passed along the highway in front of the king's palace on their way to and from a rich city on the coast. The only way that the king and Metra could obtain food now was to sit by the highway and beg of these strangers. Finally, tortured by hunger, the king one day sold his daughter as a slave to a passing merchant. By this means he obtained sufficient food to supply his wants for some time, but even this store of food, so dearly bought, could not last, and there came a time when the poor king was worse off than ever. His kingdom had become a desert. His last friend was gone. How gladly he would have given his magnificent palace and the empty honor of being a king of a forsaken country if he could have seen the great oak growing again, and his kingdom fertile and flourishing as it had once been. But it was now too late. Even Ceres could not make the trees of her sacred grove grow again, nor bring back the wood nymphs who had inhabited them. The end.